a sealed letter arrived in France during the winter of 1099, carried by a Templar courier who refused to speak about its contents. The parchment bore no official seal. Most people believe the Crusades were purely about reclaiming Jerusalem for Christianity, but within 3 months of the city's capture, European nobles were excavating beneath ancient structures with maps that shouldn't have existed. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. This is a story for sleep, so get comfortable, dim your screen brightness, and lower the volume to a comfortable level. Let this story become a bridge to your dreams. Pope Urban II stood before thousands at Clermont in 1095, preaching holy war to liberate sacred sites from Muslim control. His public sermon promised spiritual salvation and eternal glory. What he didn't mention were the private meetings held afterward with selected nobles, where different maps were distributed. These documents showed underground passages beneath Jerusalem's oldest buildings. Byzantine scholars had provided them quietly, hoping Western warriors would recover what Eastern emperors couldn't reach. The First Crusade began as expected. Armies marched, cities fell, blood soaked the roads to Jerusalem. Godfrey of Bouillon led forces that breached the walls in July 1099. Soldiers poured through streets, slaughtering defenders and celebrating their triumph. Godfrey did something unusual that same afternoon. He posted guards at 3 specific buildings before securing the rest of the city. No celebrations happened at these locations. Knights carrying tools instead of weapons entered the structures under cover of darkness. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre became a fortress with restricted access. The site where Solomon's temple once stood received similar treatment. Civilians were forbidden from approaching the dome of the rock's foundation. Other Crusader leaders noticed but said nothing publicly. Work began immediately beneath these buildings. Soldiers excavated through layers of rubble from multiple conquests: Ottoman, Mamluk, Byzantine, Roman, all the way down to Herodian stonework. The digging followed precise instructions. Teams knew exactly where to tunnel and how deep to go. Someone had provided architectural plans that predated Islam by centuries. Byzantine archives held secrets gathered over 800 years of Christian rule in the region. Emperors in Constantinople had attempted their own excavations, but lacked the manpower and political will to conduct thorough searches. Muslim conquest in 637 AD ended Byzantine control of Jerusalem, sealing whatever lay beneath. The artifacts remained buried through 4 centuries of Islamic rule, waiting for armies strong enough to reclaim access. Pope Urban II died 2 weeks after Jerusalem fell, never learning if his dual mission succeeded. The public crusade achieved its goal. Christians controlled the Holy City. The private operations results remained classified. Letters sent to Rome carried coded language about recovered materials and items of significance. No specific descriptions appeared in official correspondence. Godfrey of Bouillon established the Kingdom of Jerusalem but showed little interest in typical royal activities. He spent hours each day in underground chambers beneath the city's holiest sites. His personal guard consisted of men selected for discretion rather than combat skill. These soldiers stood watch over excavation sites, turning away curious clergy and nobles with vague explanations about structural repairs. The parallel warfare became obvious to anyone paying attention. Above ground, Crusaders fought Muslim armies for territorial control. Below ground, they searched for objects that religious texts mentioned but couldn't precisely locate: Jewish artifacts hidden during the Roman destruction of 70 AD. Christian relics concealed when Persians sacked the city in 614 AD, items from Solomon's temple that legends claimed possessed divine power. Roman records documented the looting of Jerusalem's Second Temple by Titus in 70 AD. The Arch of Titus in Rome depicted soldiers carrying the temple's golden menorah through streets as spoils of war. Historical accounts mentioned other treasures, sacred vessels, ceremonial objects, possibly the Ark of the Covenant itself. These items disappeared from Roman records after being displayed in Vespasian's triumph. Theories suggested they were hidden when Rome fell to barbarian invasions, possibly returned to Jerusalem by Byzantine Christians who valued them as holy artifacts. 3 months into the occupation, workers beneath the Church of the Holy Sepulchre broke through into a sealed chamber. The space had been deliberately filled with rubble at some point in the distant past. Clearing the debris revealed a small room carved from bedrock. Stone shelves lined the walls. Most stood empty, but one contained a bronze box sealed with lead. Godfrey received word immediately. He descended into the chamber with 2 trusted knights, ordering everyone else out. They remained underground for 6 hours. When they emerged, the bronze box was gone, and Godfrey issued new orders. The chamber was to be refilled with stone and sealed permanently. No record would document what existed there. The 2 knights who accompanied him received lands in Europe and left Jerusalem within the month. Letters began flowing to France and Italy with increased urgency. Noble families that had sent younger sons on crusades suddenly dispatched additional men with specific skills. Scholars who read Greek and Hebrew, stonemasons familiar with ancient construction techniques, priests knowledgeable about scriptural references to hidden treasures. These specialists travelled with military escorts and significant funding. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre became a maze of scaffolding and excavation. Above ground, pilgrims prayed at Christianity's holiest site. Below ground, teams carved through solid rock following architectural details described in texts written before Islam existed. The work continued day and night. Guards prevented civilians from accessing certain areas, claiming danger from unstable stonework. Muslim observers in surrounding territories noticed the unusual activity. Spies reported that Crusaders seemed more interested in digging than defending their new kingdom. Fatimid commanders in Egypt puzzled over intelligence describing extensive excavation operations. The reports made no military sense. Why waste resources on underground construction when armies needed fortifications and supply lines? The answer lay in what Crusaders believed they would find. Medieval Christianity placed enormous value on physical relics, objects touched by holy figures, fragments of the true cross, bones of martyred saints. These weren't merely symbolic items. People believed relics possessed actual power to heal diseases, protect armies, and channel divine intervention. A kingdom that controlled Jerusalem's artifacts would dominate European politics and church hierarchy. Jewish communities had hidden their most sacred objects during the Roman siege of Jerusalem. Knowing the city would fall, priests concealed ceremonial vessels and scrolls in locations they hoped future generations would recover. Some hiding places were marked, others known only to small groups who died defending the temple. Christian refugees did the same during Persian and later Muslim conquests, creating layers of buried materials beneath the city's churches and sacred sites. Godfrey's teams found evidence of previous excavations, Byzantine tunnels from the 4th and 5th centuries, crudely dug and abandoned when workers hit bedrock or ran out of funding. Muslim construction from the Umayyad period that carefully avoided certain foundation stones, suggesting knowledge of what lay beneath. The Crusaders possessed advantages earlier searchers lacked: detailed maps, unlimited manpower, and religious authority to excavate anywhere without local opposition. 5 months after Jerusalem's capture, a second major discovery occurred beneath the site of Solomon's Temple. Workers breaking through a limestone wall found a passage extending deep under the Temple Mount. Byzantine markers indicated the tunnel had been explored centuries earlier but ended at collapse. Crusader engineers cleared the rockfall revealing spaces that hadn't been entered in over 1,000 years. The passage descended through layers of construction: Herodian, Hasmonean, Persian period stonework, each representing a different era of Jerusalem's history. At the deepest level, workers found chambers carved during the First Temple period. Inscriptions in ancient Hebrew covered the walls. Priests who could read the archaic script went pale when translating the text. The inscriptions described what had been stored there and when it was removed. The chambers stood empty. Whatever they once contained had been evacuated long ago, possibly during the Babylonian conquest in 586 BC. The inscriptions provided details about items taken to Babylon and later lost during that empire's fall to the Persians. Some treasures returned to Jerusalem during the Second Temple period. Others vanished into private collections of Babylonian nobles and never resurfaced. Godfrey ordered the passages mapped completely. Engineers spent weeks surveying every tunnel and chamber beneath the Temple Mount. The resulting diagram showed an extensive network of spaces, most empty but carefully maintained by someone in the distant past. Stone-cutting techniques dated the work to different periods, creating a timeline of when each section was excavated. One tunnel led to a natural cave system that extended beyond the city walls. Explorers following the passages emerged outside Jerusalem's fortifications in an olive grove. The exit had been concealed with a false rock face that blended perfectly with surrounding formations. This discovery changed everything. If spaces could be accessed from outside the city, previous occupants could have moved materials secretly without detection. Teams began searching the countryside around Jerusalem for other hidden entrances. They found 17 locations over the next 2 years: caves, cisterns, and artificial tunnels that connected to underground spaces beneath the city. Each was excavated methodically. Most contained nothing but evidence of prior exploration. 3 held fragments of material that specialized clergy identified as having religious significance. The finds were modest but authentic: a bronze oil lamp matching descriptions from temple ceremonies, stone vessels of a type mentioned in Levitical texts, fragments of pottery with Hebrew inscriptions referencing donations to the temple treasury. These weren't the legendary artifacts Crusaders hoped to discover, but they proved the search was based on historical reality, not fantasy. European nobles grew impatient. They had financed armies expecting immediate returns. Letters arrived demanding explanations for the extensive excavation operations. Some Crusade leaders openly questioned Godfrey's priorities, suggesting he was neglecting military necessities for treasure hunting. Tension mounted between those who saw the Crusades as holy war and those pursuing the artifact search as a primary objective. Godfrey ignored the criticism. He expanded operations, hiring Muslim and Jewish labourers who knew Jerusalem's ancient architecture. These men worked under guard but proved invaluable for understanding how pre-Crusader builders had designed underground spaces. Some cooperated, hoping to protect their communities. Others were paid extraordinarily well for their knowledge. A few genuinely believed important historical materials should be preserved regardless of who controlled the surface. By the end of 1100, 17 excavation sites operated simultaneously beneath Jerusalem. The city resembled a honeycomb, with passages and chambers extending in all directions under streets and buildings. Surface structures began showing stress from underground work. Walls cracked, foundations shifted, and several buildings collapsed partially when support was removed during digging. Then workers at the Church of the Nativity site found something that changed the entire operation's urgency. A sealed container embedded in a wall, placed there deliberately by someone who marked its location with Greek text. The inscription warned that opening the container would reveal truth that challenged official church doctrine. It was opened anyway. Inside lay documents that would redirect the artifact search and raise questions about what early Christian authorities had hidden from their own followers. The documents from the Church of the Nativity container describe locations beneath the Temple Mount with precision that suggested first-hand knowledge. Maps drawn on vellum showed chambers and passages that official historical records never mentioned. Measurements were given in ancient cubits, indicating the author lived during the Second Temple period or shortly after its destruction. Most disturbing were marginal notes added by a later hand in Latin, suggesting Byzantine officials had possessed these papers and understood their significance. The documents referenced artifacts by name and function: golden vessels used in daily temple ceremonies, silver trumpets mentioned in scriptural passages, bronze implements for sacrificial rituals. The Ark of the Covenant received multiple mentions with specific details about its last known location before the Babylonian conquest. According to the text, priests had moved it from the Holy of Holies to a chamber excavated beneath the Temple Mount specifically for concealment during emergencies. Godfrey restricted access to the documents immediately. Only 3 clerics were allowed to study the texts, and they worked under armed guard in a sealed room. Their translation work continued for months as they deciphered archaic terminology and cross-referenced biblical passages. The maps proved most valuable, showing architectural features that could be matched against current Temple Mount structures. Excavation efforts shifted entirely to the Temple Mount area. Previous work at 17 sites across Jerusalem was suspended. All available workers concentrated on the zone where Solomon's temple once stood. Muslim authorities protested this focused attention on the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque, but Crusader military control made opposition pointless. Guards prevented Muslim civilians from approaching while Christian workers dug beneath structures that Islamic tradition held sacred. The operation expanded beyond what manpower allowed. Godfrey requested additional workers from Europe, specifically requesting men who could keep secrets and follow orders without question. The response was immediate. Nobles sent contingents of trusted soldiers, many of whom had no combat experience but possessed skills in mining and stone-cutting. These men arrived with equipment designed for excavation rather than warfare. Progress came slowly beneath the Temple Mount. Workers encountered Byzantine tunnels that had reached critical locations, but lacked tools to continue through solid bedrock. Crusader teams brought iron chisels and techniques learned from European mining operations. They carved through barriers that had stopped previous explorers, opening spaces that hadn't been entered since the Romans demolished the Second Temple. Godfrey died in 1100, officially from illness, but possibly from something encountered underground. His successor, Baldwin I, inherited the excavation operation and continued it with even greater intensity. Baldwin treated the search as his primary responsibility, delegating military matters to subordinates, while he supervised underground work personally. He descended into the tunnels daily, often staying below ground for 12 hours or more. The year 1118 marked a transition. Baldwin thus died without revealing what the 18-year excavation had discovered. His cousin Baldwin III assumed the throne and immediately altered the operation structure. Instead of continuing massive excavations with hundreds of workers, he approved a different approach. A small group would work in complete secrecy with unlimited time and resources. The Temple Mount would be sealed to all except this select team. 9 French knights arrived in Jerusalem during 1119 with credentials from powerful European nobles. Their leader Hugh de Payens claimed they had come to protect pilgrims travelling from the coast to Jerusalem. This explanation made no tactical sense. 9 men couldn't protect anyone across hostile territory, and other military orders already provided pilgrim security with far larger forces. Baldwin VI accepted their stated mission publicly, while granting them private permissions that contradicted it. The 9 knights received quarters in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. built on the southern end of the Temple Mount platform. This location gave them exclusive access to the structures directly above the areas where previous excavations had concentrated. For the first time in 20 years, large worker teams disappeared from the site. The knights claimed to need privacy for their religious devotions and military training. Guards prevented anyone from entering the Temple Mount without explicit royal permission. What happened during the next 9 years remains partially documented through evidence left behind. The knights excavated systematically beneath the Al-Aqsa Mosque, creating a network of tunnels that modern archaeologists have partially mapped. These passages show clear purpose. They target specific locations beneath the platform rather than exploring randomly. The tunnels connect to earlier Byzantine and Crusader excavations, suggesting the 9 knights possessed maps showing where previous work had stopped. Physical evidence contradicts the knights' stated mission. Tools left in sealed chambers include mining equipment, timber for tunnel supports, and iron reinforcement bars. No weapons or defensive structures appear in the underground spaces. The work was archaeological, not military. Someone directed the excavations with precise knowledge of what lay beneath and where to find it. Templar marks carved into stone throughout the tunnels match symbols that would later become associated with the Knights Templar Order. The 9 knights were not yet officially recognized as a military order during their first years in Jerusalem, yet they already used distinctive markings suggesting organizational identity existed before church approval. These symbols appear at excavation sites, on support timbers, and carved into tunnel walls at significant junctions. The knights worked without supervision. Baldwin said visited occasionally, but allowed them complete operational control. Church authorities in Jerusalem seemed unaware of the excavation's extent, believing the knights genuinely focused on pilgrim protection. Letters sent to Europe described the 9 as exemplary warriors performing dangerous but noble work. No mention of digging or artifact recovery appeared in official correspondence. Underground progress accelerated compared to the previous massive operations. 9 men working with focused purpose achieved more than hundreds of workers supervised by rotating commanders. They knew exactly where to dig and wasted no effort on areas the maps indicated would be empty. Tunnels drove straight toward chambers marked in the ancient documents, bypassing spaces that yielded nothing during earlier explorations. The breakthrough came sometime between 1125 and 1127, based on subsequent events. The exact date remains unknown because the knights maintained absolute secrecy. What is documented is their sudden decision to return to Europe after 9 years of underground work. Judepaeans and several companions left Jerusalem abruptly, claiming they needed to recruit more members for their protection mission. They left a small contingent behind to continue the work. The return to Europe revealed something extraordinary. Judepaeans arrived with significant material wealth, despite having spent 9 years supposedly living in monastic poverty. He met with Pope Honorius II and various European nobles, presenting evidence of discoveries made beneath Jerusalem. Whatever he showed them generated immediate support. The Church granted official recognition to the Knights Templar in 1129, creating a military order with unprecedented privileges and exemptions from local authority. Templar wealth appeared suddenly in banking records across Europe. Accounts showed massive deposits of gold and silver in Templar treasuries with no clear source. The order's financial operations expanded rapidly, establishing banking houses that would eventually finance kingdoms and control trade routes. This economic power emerged impossibly fast for an organization that claimed 9 founding members working on charity. Ships sailed from Acre to France carrying cargo described only as sacred materials and items of significance. Venetian customs records noted Templar vessels that bypassed standard inspection procedures, paying enormous fees for privacy rather than submitting to normal examination. The cargoes were transferred to fortified Templar properties in southern France and disappeared from documentation. No inventories listed what the crates contained. Pope Honorius II granted Templars the right to build churches, collect tithes, and bury their dead in their own cemeteries. These permissions gave the order autonomy that worried local bishops, but delighted European nobles who saw Templars as a force that could operate across political boundaries. The Vatican had never granted such comprehensive independence to any religious organisation. Something Hugh de Payens presented during his 1129 meetings convinced church authorities to create a military order with unprecedented power. The 9 Knights' discoveries remained classified. No Templar record describes what was found beneath the Temple Mount. Later interrogations during the order's suppression in 1307 included questions about Jerusalem excavations and artifact recovery. Templars either refused to answer or claimed ignorance of what early members had discovered. Several stated that secrets were known only to the order's highest leadership and were never written down. Archaeological work in modern times revealed the extent of medieval excavation beneath the Temple Mount. British archaeologists exploring the area in the 1860s found passages carved through solid bedrock, clearly the work of systematic operations rather than natural cave systems. The tunnels showed evidence of medieval tool marks matching other Crusader construction. Some passages extended 40 feet below the platform surface, reaching levels that required years of work to access. Artifacts left in the tunnels proved the operations continued long after the original 9 Knights departed. Later Templar marks appear alongside the earlier symbols, suggesting the order maintained excavation teams at the site throughout the 12th century. Tools dated to different periods show continuous work spanning decades. Someone kept digging even as Crusader military fortunes declined, and Muslim forces recaptured territory around Jerusalem. The Al-Aqsa tunnels connected to water systems that predated Islam by centuries. Ancient cisterns and aqueducts provided access routes that allowed movement beneath the city without surface detection. Templars exploited these passages, expanding them to reach chambers their maps indicated contained important materials. Some tunnels intersected earlier Roman excavations, suggesting multiple civilizations had searched the Temple Mount's foundations for the same legendary artifacts. Evidence of removed objects appears in several chambers. Stone pedestals show tool marks indicating something was detached carefully. Alcoves carved into walls are empty, but shaped specifically to hold rectangular containers. Impressions in ancient mortar suggest wooden chests or metal boxes rested in locations for extended periods before removal. Whatever had been stored there was gone by the time modern archaeologists arrived. The 9 Knights' mission accomplished something that changed medieval history. Whether they found the Ark of the Covenant, temple treasures, ancient scrolls, or other materials remains debated. What cannot be disputed is the transformation of 9 impoverished French knights into the founders of the wealthiest military order in Christendom. The source of Templar power traces directly to whatever emerged from those tunnels beneath Jerusalem. Banking operations expanded across Europe with Templar houses in every major city. Kings deposited their treasuries in Templar fortresses. Merchants used Templar letters of credit that were honoured internationally. The order became essential to medieval economy, controlling more liquid wealth than most kingdoms. This financial empire began with 9 men digging beneath a mosque in Jerusalem, finding something valuable enough to purchase unprecedented political influence. The Temple Mount excavations continued under Templar control until Muslim forces recaptured Jerusalem in 1187. Saladin's armies found the tunnels and sealed them, filling passages with rubble to prevent further Christian exploration. But by then, Templars had worked the site for 68 years. Whatever could be removed was already gone, shipped to Europe in the mysterious crates that Venetian records documented but never described. The artifacts entered Templar treasuries and disappeared from history, their locations known only to the Order's inner circle, and possibly lost even to them during later persecutions. The artifacts emerging from Jerusalem created a market that transformed medieval economics. Churches across Europe competed viciously for prestigious relics, understanding that sacred objects attracted pilgrims who brought donations. A cathedral possessing the finger bone of a major saint could generate more annual revenue than agricultural estates. The incentive to acquire relics overrode theological concerns about commercializing holiness. Prices reached astronomical levels by 1150. A fragment supposedly from the true cross sold for 3,000 silver marks, enough to fund a small army for a year. Authenticated relics commanded even higher sums, with provenance documentation adding significant value. Churches mortgaged property to finance acquisitions, gambling that pilgrimage income would cover the debts. Many succeeded. Several went bankrupt when authentication proved fraudulent, or competing churches acquired superior relics that drew pilgrims away. Crusader states became the primary source for new relics entering the market. Knights returning from Jerusalem carried items purchased from local dealers or excavated during military operations. A cottage industry emerged in Acre and other coastal cities, where merchants specialized in religious artifacts. Some dealt in genuine antiquities recovered from archaeological sites. Others sold recent forgeries manufactured to meet European demand that far exceeded authentic supply. The authentication process relied on methods that modern observers would consider inadequate. Church officials examined items for signs of age, tested metals for composition, and evaluated stylistic details against known examples. When physical evidence proved inconclusive, they resorted to supernatural verification. Relics were placed on altars overnight with prayers requesting divine confirmation. Morning visions or miraculous healings were interpreted as authentication. Lack of supernatural events suggested fraudulence, though determined buyers often tried multiple tests until achieving favorable results. Professional authenticators appeared by 1160, traveling between cities to evaluate relics for wealthy buyers. These specialists claimed expertise in identifying genuine articles based on historical knowledge and spiritual sensitivity. Their fees matched their services' value. Authentication of a major relic cost hundreds of silver marks. Some authenticators operated honestly within the limits of medieval knowledge. Others accepted bribes from sellers to certify obvious frauds. The profession attracted both devoted scholars and cynical opportunists who exploited believers' desperation for sacred connections. Constantinople held Europe's largest concentration of relics, accumulated over 8 centuries of Byzantine Christian rule. The city's churches contained artifacts from across the former Roman Empire, gathered by emperors who understood sacred objects' political value. Imperial collections included items supposedly touched by Christ, fragments of the true cross in elaborate golden reliquaries, bones of apostles and martyrs, and clothing worn by the Virgin Mary. The concentration of holiness in one location made Constantinople irresistible to Western Christians, who viewed Byzantines as schismatic rivals, hoarding treasures that belonged to the Universal Church. The Fourth Crusade was supposed to recapture Jerusalem from Muslim control. Pope Innocent III authorized the expedition in 1202, offering spiritual rewards to participants. Venetian ships transported the army, demanding payment the Crusaders couldn't provide. Venetian leadership proposed an alternative. The fleet would carry the army to Constantinople instead of Jerusalem, settling Venetian political grievances against Byzantium while giving Crusaders access to the Byzantine treasury. The proposal was accepted. Religious war transformed into economic raid. Constantinople fell to Crusader assault in April 1204. What followed was systematic looting on a scale that shocked even medieval observers accustomed to warfare's brutality. Soldiers stripped churches bare, prying jewelled covers from gospel books and melting them for the precious metals. Reliquaries were smashed open to extract the bones and fragments they contained. Altars were demolished to check for hidden compartments. The sack continued for 3 days, destroying centuries of artistic and religious heritage while enriching the attackers beyond imagination. The relic distribution began immediately after the violence ended. Crusader leaders divided the most prestigious items according to rank and political influence. French nobles claimed artifacts associated with Christ's Passion. Venetians took relics they could sell profitably to Italian churches. German knights secured materials to enhance their family chapel's prestige. Lower-ranking soldiers grabbed whatever remained, creating a flood of Byzantine artifacts flowing westward. Venetian merchants organized the largest commercial operation in medieval history. Ships loaded with crates of relics departed Constantinople monthly throughout 1204 and 1205. Manifests listed hundreds of items per voyage: saints' bones packed in straw, icon panels wrapped in canvas, golden crosses and jewelled vessels secured in locked strongboxes. The cargo's documented value exceeded the annual revenue of most European kingdoms. Actual value was higher because many items travelled undocumented to avoid customs duties and church officials who might question their acquisition methods. Venice profited enormously from the relic trade. Customs fees on religious cargo financed public works and military expansion. Venetian churches received first choice of arriving artifacts, making the city a pilgrimage destination that boosted local economy. Merchant families that financed the Fourth Crusade recovered their investments within 2 years through relic sales. Some became wealthier than minor nobility through systematic exploitation of Constantinople's sacred treasures. Authentication concerns disappeared in the flood of Byzantine artifacts. Items with imperial provenance were automatically accepted as genuine regardless of historical probability. Multiple churches claimed to possess the same saint's complete skull or identical fragments of the same relic. The contradiction went unaddressed because admitting fraud would devalue expensive acquisitions and embarrass bishops who had authenticated them. European Christianity collectively chose belief over skepticism. The crown of thorns became the most contested artifact from Constantinople's sack. Multiple crowns or fragments appeared in Western Europe between 1204 and 1210, each claimed as the authentic headpiece placed on Christ during crucifixion. Emperor Baldwin II of Constantinople pawned the imperial crown to Venetian merchants in 1238 to finance his bankrupt regime. French King Louis IX purchased it for 135,000 livres, more than half France's annual royal revenue. The crown arrived in Paris with documentation tracing ownership through Byzantine emperors to Helena's original discovery in Jerusalem. Louis IX built Sainte-Chapelle specifically to house the crown of thorns and other passion relics he acquired. The chapel's construction cost 40,000 livres, less than a third of what he paid for the crown itself. This financial disparity demonstrates how medieval rulers valued sacred objects more highly than architectural masterpieces. The crown's presence in Paris elevated French religious prestige above rival kingdoms and justified Louis's enormous expenditure through increased pilgrimage revenue and political influence. Competing claims to authentic crowns persisted despite Louis's acquisition. Spanish churches possessed thorns supposedly from the same crown, authenticated by papal officials who swore they sensed divine presence. Italian cathedrals displayed intact crown sections with documentation showing different ownership histories than the Paris crown. Rather than resolving the contradiction, church authorities accepted multiple authentic crowns as miraculous multiplication similar to Christ's feeding of multitudes. The theological flexibility allowed all parties to maintain their claims and preserve their artifacts' value. Non-Christian relics entered the market through less public channels. Jewish ceremonial objects from Jerusalem synagogues appeared in European collections, purchased by nobles curious about Hebrew practices or seeking items mentioned in Old Testament passages. Islamic artifacts from captured mosques attracted buyers interested in their artistic merit or exotic origins. These non-Christian materials commanded lower prices than Christian relics, but still generated significant trade. Some buyer acquired them for scholarly study. Others hoped to discover magical properties attributed to foreign religious traditions. The underground market operated alongside official channels. Artifacts of questionable provenance or dubious authenticity sold to buyers unwilling to pay premium prices for certified relics. Forgers supplied this market with recently manufactured items artificially aged through chemical treatment and deliberate damage. The forgery techniques grew sophisticated, with specialists creating items that fooled even experienced authenticators. Some forgeries were so well executed that they entered major church collections and remain there today, their true origins unknown to current custodians. Prices varied based on the saint's importance and the relic's physical size. First-class relics, actual body parts of major saints, commanded highest prices. Second-class relics, objects touched by saints during their lifetimes, sold for significantly less. Third-class relics, materials touched to first- or second-class relics, were essentially worthless except to the poorest churches desperate for any sacred connection. This hierarchy created stratification in the relic market matching social hierarchies, with wealthy institutions monopolizing prestigious artifacts, while smaller churches settled for fragments and contact relics. Economic impact extended beyond direct sales. Pilgrimage routes developed around major relic collections, creating business opportunities for innkeepers, food vendors, and craftsmen producing pilgrim badges and souvenirs. Towns possessing important relics grew wealthy from tourism, building infrastructure to accommodate thousands of visitors during feast days. Regions lacking significant relics stagnated economically, unable to compete for the pilgrimage trade that enriched their rivals. The relic economy reshaped medieval Europe's financial geography. Kingdoms bankrupted themselves pursuing sacred artifacts. Philip II of France spent enormous sums competing with Louis IX's acquisitions, determined that Paris shouldn't monopolize prestigious relics. English kings purchased major relics to enhance Westminster Abbey's status. German emperors bought artifacts to legitimize their claims to Holy Roman Empire leadership. The spending created debt crises that required higher taxation and forced rulers to sell royal properties. The economic strain contributed to political instability when taxpayers resented funding what they perceived as royal vanity projects. The Crusader state's collapse in the late 1200s ended the primary source for new relics entering European markets. Supply contracted dramatically while demand remained constant. Prices for authenticated artifacts increased beyond what most churches could afford. The scarcity drove innovation in the forgery industry, with criminals producing sophisticated fakes that satisfied buyers unable to acquire genuine articles. Some forgers were eventually executed when their frauds were exposed. Others retired wealthy, their deceptions undiscovered during their lifetimes. Ownership disputes generated prolonged legal battles. Churches that purchased relics later claimed as fraudulent demanded refunds from sellers who had spent the money decades earlier. Competing institutions claimed ownership of artifacts seized during Constantinople's sack, arguing over whose ancestors had legitimate rights to the looted materials. Papal courts heard hundreds of cases involving relic ownership, authentication disputes, and fraud allegations. The litigation created employment for canon lawyers specializing in religious property law. The relic economy created a paradox that troubled thoughtful observers. Sacred objects meant to inspire devotion became commodities traded for profit. Church officials who preached against worldly materialism negotiated like merchants over fragment prices. The contradiction between Christian teachings about spiritual versus material value seemed obvious, yet the trade continued because everyone involved benefited financially. Criticism was suppressed as heretical questioning of practices that enriched powerful institutions. By 1250, virtually every European church possessed relics acquired directly or indirectly through Crusader operations. The artifacts connected medieval Christians to holy figures and events in ways that sermons and scripture couldn't match. Physical objects that saints supposedly touched or that came from Christ's crucifixion made religious history tangible and immediate. Whether authentic or fraudulent became less important than their function as focal points for devotion and generators of revenue that sustained religious institutions through the medieval period and beyond. A starving French peasant named Peter Bartholomew claimed to see visions in June 1098 during the siege of Antioch. His dreams showed the exact location of the lance that pierced Christ's side during crucifixion, buried beneath the floor of St. Peter's Cathedral inside the besieged city. The Crusaders were trapped, surrounded by a massive Turkish army with no supplies and no hope. Morale had collapsed to the point where soldiers were deserting nightly, slipping through enemy lines to escape what seemed certain death. Raymond of Toulouse authorized excavation despite skepticism from other nobles who considered the vision's convenient timing from a nobody seeking attention. Workers broke through the cathedral floor and dug through layers of debris and earth. Hours passed with no discovery. Peter Bartholomew jumped into the excavation pit as observers prepared to abandon the search. He emerged moments later holding an iron spearhead darkened with age and corrosion. The timing was impossible to ignore. The army's transformation happened within days. Soldiers who had been discussing surrender terms suddenly demanded immediate battle. Knights who couldn't stand from weakness found strength to mount horses and prepare for combat. The psychological shift defied military logic. Nothing about their tactical situation had improved, yet the presence of this ancient spearhead convinced men they would win. Raymond's forces marched out to face the Turkish army on June 28th, carrying the lance at the front of their formation. The Battle of Antioch ended in complete Crusader victory against overwhelming odds. Turkish forces that outnumbered the Christians 3-1 broke and fled after initial contact. Historians still debate whether the lance caused the victory, or if the Turkish command structure happened to collapse coincidentally. What mattered to the Crusaders was their belief that the relic provided divine protection. Word spread across the Christian forces that possessing authentic artifacts from Christ's passion made armies invincible. Skepticism emerged immediately from unexpected quarters. Adhemar of Le Puy, the papal legate accompanying the crusade, questioned the lance's authenticity publicly. He pointed out that Peter Bartholomew's visions conveniently occurred when morale reached its lowest point. The discovery location seemed improbable. Why would Roman soldiers' equipment end up buried beneath a church floor in Antioch rather than Jerusalem? The relic's miraculous appearance during desperate circumstances suggested fraud designed to manipulate frightened soldiers. Peter Bartholomew defended the lance's authenticity by offering to undergo ordeal by fire. The test was conducted in April 1099, with massive crowds gathering to witness whether God would protect the peasant visionary from flames. Peter walked through burning timber, carrying the lance, emerging with severe burns that killed him within days. His death should have proven the lance fraudulent according to ordeal logic. Instead, Supporters claim the burns resulted from crowds pushing Peter back into the fire accidentally, not from divine judgment. The lance's status remained disputed. Meanwhile, Byzantine Emperor Alexios I possessed his own holy lance that imperial records trace through centuries of documented ownership. The Byzantine relic had been venerated in Constantinople since before the First Crusade began, stored in the imperial treasury with other Passion artifacts. Alexios displayed his lance to visiting crusaders, attempting to prove the Antioch discovery was either a different object or fraudulent. Western nobles dismissed the Byzantine claim as Eastern jealousy over the Antioch miracle. Two authentic lances created theological problems that church officials addressed through creative interpretation. Some argued that the Roman soldier Longinus used multiple lances during Christ's crucifixion, making several objects authentic. Others suggested the lance broke into pieces that were distributed, with both Antioch and Constantinople possessing genuine fragments. A third explanation proposed that God miraculously reproduced the lance to serve multiple Christian communities simultaneously. All three theories had theological weaknesses, but served the necessary function of allowing both relics to coexist without mutual invalidation. The Antioch lance travelled with Crusader armies throughout the subsequent campaigns. Soldiers reported feeling courage increase when fighting near the relic. Knights who had shown cowardice in previous battles fought with reckless aggression when the lance was present. Skeptical commanders who doubted the artifact's authenticity still valued its psychological impact on troops. Whether genuine or fraudulent mattered less than the morale boost it provided during desperate situations. Islamic forces captured the Antioch lance in 1098 during a skirmish shortly after the Battle of Antioch. The psychological devastation to Christian morale exceeded the military significance of the defeat. Soldiers who had believed the lance made them invincible suddenly questioned whether God supported their mission. Some concluded Peter Bartholomew's deathbed proved the relic was fake, making their previous victories coincidental rather than divinely assisted. Commanders struggled to prevent mass desertion after the capture. The lance reappeared in Crusader hands weeks later, under circumstances that remain unclear. Either it was ransomed back through negotiations, recovered during a counterattack, or replaced with a substitute that soldiers accepted as the original. Historical records provide conflicting accounts of the recovery, suggesting different chroniclers heard different versions of events. The lance continued accompanying armies after its return, though some nobles privately expressed doubt about whether the recovered artifact matched what had been captured. Ottoman Sultan Bayezid I claimed to possess the authentic Holy Lance in the late 14th century, centuries after the Crusades ended. His lance supposedly came from Byzantine imperial treasures seized when Ottoman forces captured Constantinople in 1453. The Ottomans valued the relic as a trophy, proving their superiority over Christian powers rather than for religious significance. European ambassadors who saw the Ottoman lance reported it matched descriptions of the Byzantine imperial relic, suggesting the Constantinople artifact had outlasted its Christian custodians. Pope Innocent VIII received an additional Holy Lance in 1492 when Ottoman Prince Sem, held as a political prisoner in Rome, offered it as a gift or bribe. This lance allegedly came from the Ottoman treasury, though how Prince Sem obtained it remains unexplained. The Vatican accepted the relic and placed it in St. Peter's Basilica, where it remains today. Whether this was the Byzantine lance, the Antioch lance, or an entirely different object has never been definitively established. Metallurgical analysis conducted in modern times revealed that the Vatican lance contains a nail forged using Roman-era techniques. The metal composition matches other authenticated 1st century Roman ironwork. Dating tests place the nail's manufacture between 100 BC and 100 AD, making it contemporary with Christ's crucifixion. This scientific evidence proves the object is genuinely ancient and Roman, though it cannot confirm whether this specific nail pierced Christ's side as tradition claims. The socket holding the nail in the Vatican lance was added during the medieval period, proven through different metallurgical composition and construction techniques. Someone took an authentic Roman nail and attached it to a spear shaft centuries after the original event, creating a relic that combined genuine historical artifact with later additions. Whether the nail itself was always the Holy Lance or became one through medieval construction remains debatable. Military commanders throughout the Crusades weaponized relics as psychological warfare tools. Armies carrying prestigious artifacts into battle gained confidence, while enemies suffered demoralization from fighting forces believed to have divine protection. The effect worked regardless of relics' authenticity because medieval warriors genuinely believed in supernatural intervention. A fake relic that soldiers accepted as genuine provided identical psychological benefits to an authentic one. The capture of important relics became a military objective equal to seizing cities or defeating armies. Commanders specifically targeted churches and treasuries known to house significant artifacts. Victory celebrations included public displays of captured relics, humiliating defeated enemies by showing their holy objects under enemy control. Ransoming captured artifacts back to their original owners generated revenue and provided diplomatic leverage during peace negotiations. Saladin's forces captured the largest fragment of the True Cross at the Battle of Hattin in 1187. The psychological impact devastated Christian morale more severely than the military defeat. The True Cross fragment had accompanied Crusader armies for decades, present at every major battle, and viewed as guaranteeing divine favour. Its loss suggested God had withdrawn support from the Crusader cause. Many soldiers interpreted the capture as divine judgment against Christian sins, leading to crisis of faith that weakened military effectiveness more than battlefield casualties. Negotiations to ransom the True Cross fragment failed because Saladin understood its propaganda value. He paraded the captured relic through Damascus and other Islamic cities, demonstrating to Muslim populations that Christian claims of divine protection were empty. The relic disappeared from historical records after Saladin's death, possibly destroyed, lost, or hidden so thoroughly that its location was forgotten. Attempts by later Crusader forces to recover it through military action and diplomatic offers all failed. The multiplication of holy lances created a market where authenticity became increasingly difficult to verify. Churches across Europe claimed to possess the genuine article by the 13th century, each with documentation tracing ownership through impressive chains of custody. Vienna's Hofburg Palace held a lance that Holy Roman emperors carried into battle for centuries. Echmiadzin Cathedral in Armenia possessed another traced to apostolic times. Krakow Cathedral in Poland displayed a lance supposedly brought back from the Holy Land by returning crusaders. The competing claims never received definitive resolution. Church authorities avoided declaring any lance fraudulent because doing so would devalue a prestigious relic owned by powerful institutions. Instead, the multiplicity was explained through theological frameworks that allowed multiple authentic objects. Some scholars proposed that different lances were used sequentially during Christ's crucifixion, making several objects authentic. Others argued that miraculous multiplication similar to the loaves and fishes story created multiple genuine articles from a single original. Modern examination of the various holy lances reveals that several are genuinely ancient weapons, while others are medieval constructions. The Vienna lance contains a nail that metallurgical tests date to the Roman period. The Vatican lance similarly contains 1st century components. The Echmiadzin lance has not undergone scientific testing, leaving its age uncertain. Other claimed holy lances are definitively medieval, or later fabrications based on construction techniques and materials that didn't exist during Christ's lifetime. The question of authenticity versus belief's power remained unresolved throughout the Crusades and beyond. Warriors who fought courageously while carrying what they believed was the Holy Lance achieved real military victories regardless of the relic's actual origins. The psychological impact was genuine even if the artifact wasn't. Medieval understanding made no distinction between supernatural power inherent in an object and supernatural power created through human faith in that object. Both produced identical results on battlefields where belief determined whether soldiers fought or fled. The legacy of the Holy Lance mystery extends beyond medieval warfare into philosophical questions about material objects' spiritual significance. If a fraudulent relic inspired genuine religious devotion and produced real historical consequences, did its fraudulence matter? The Crusaders who fought at Antioch believed the lance provided divine protection and won a battle they should have lost. Whether the spearhead actually pierced Christ's side became secondary to the faith it inspired and the victory that faith achieved. The artifact's power came from belief rather than authenticity, making the question of which lance was real ultimately unanswerable and perhaps irrelevant. Helena Augusta travelled to Jerusalem in 326 AD at age 78, searching for physical evidence of her son Constantine's newly adopted faith. Imperial resources funded excavations at sites matching gospel descriptions of Christ's crucifixion. Workers clearing rubble from a cistern near Golgotha discovered 3 wooden crosses buried beneath centuries of accumulated debris. Local bishops authenticated one as the true cross through a test involving a dying woman who allegedly recovered when touched by the correct wood. The cross was divided immediately. Helena took portions back to Constantinople, while leaving the majority in Jerusalem's Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This initial fragmentation established a pattern that would accelerate during the Crusades. By the time Western forces captured Jerusalem in 1099, the true cross fragments were scattered across the Byzantine Empire and beyond. Each piece was enshrined in elaborate golden reliquaries that often cost more than the wood they contained. Mathematical calculations conducted by skeptics in the 16th century estimated that all claimed true cross fragments in European churches would collectively weigh several tons. The wood would have required multiple trees rather than the single crossbeam described in Gospel accounts. Yet the multiplication continued unchecked throughout the medieval period, because each fragment generated wealth and prestige for its owner. Churches holding true cross pieces attracted pilgrims who donated money, purchased indulgences, and commissioned masses. Crusaders arriving in Jerusalem found the city's primary true cross fragment displayed prominently in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The relic was massive compared to European specimens, a section of beam approximately 3 feet long and 6 inches thick, mounted in a golden reliquary studded with precious stones. Byzantine craftsmen had created the container centuries earlier, and its artistic and material value exceeded most European royal treasures. The wood inside was barely visible through protective crystal panels. Godfrey of Bouillon established a pattern of carrying the Jerusalem cross into battle. Armies marching behind the relic fought with enhanced courage, believing divine protection made them invincible. The strategy worked repeatedly during the early Crusader period, producing victories that military analysis suggested should have gone to the numerically superior Muslim forces. Whether supernatural intervention or psychological confidence caused the victories remained debatable, but commanders continued the practice because results justified it. The Battle of Hattin in July 1187 changed everything. Saladin's forces surrounded the Crusader army in northern Palestine under brutal summer heat. Christian forces carried the true cross into battle as usual, expecting divine intervention. Instead, they suffered catastrophic defeat. The relic fell into Muslim hands when the bishop carrying it was killed during the rout. Saladin's men found the cross among the battlefield casualties and recognized it immediately from its distinctive reliquary. The psychological devastation rippled across Christian territories. Soldiers who had trusted the cross to protect them now questioned whether God supported their cause. The loss suggested divine abandonment more powerfully than military defeat alone could convey. European churches that held smaller true cross fragments experienced diminished pilgrimage traffic as believers wondered whether any of the relics possessed authentic power after the primary fragment failed so spectacularly. Saladin understood the capture's propaganda value better than its religious significance. He paraded the relic through Damascus with the cross inverted as an insult to Christian sacred symbols. Muslim chroniclers recorded the display in detail, describing how Christians in the crowd wept at seeing their holiest object desecrated. The spectacle demonstrated Islamic military superiority in religious terms that medieval populations understood intuitively. God favored Muslims over Christians, proved through which side possessed the sacred artifacts. Ransom negotiations began within months. Richard the Lionheart offered enormous sums to recover the true cross, recognizing that its return would restore Christian morale more effectively than any military victory. Saladin refused every offer, understanding that keeping the relic inflicted ongoing psychological damage worth more than gold. The cross disappeared from historical records after 1193, possibly destroyed, lost during succession disputes following Saladin's death, or hidden so successfully that its location was forgotten. Modern searches have never recovered it. The Jerusalem cross's loss accelerated fragmentation of remaining true cross pieces. European churches that possessed fragments began subdividing them further, creating additional relics to meet demand from institutions wanting replacements for what was lost. A single splinter became 10 smaller splinters. Fragments the size of a fingernail were mounted in elaborate reliquaries and authenticated as possessing the same divine power as the original beam. The multiplication logic followed medieval understanding that sacred objects retained holiness regardless of how small they were divided. Scientific analysis conducted on true cross fragments in modern times reveals a wide range of wood types and ages. Some specimens are cedar-matching species native to 1st century Palestine. These pieces could plausibly be authentic or at least contemporary with Christ's crucifixion. Other fragments are oak or pine from species that don't grow in the Middle East, proving they are European forgeries. Carbon dating places some specimens in the correct historical period, while others are clearly medieval or later constructions. The authentication problem extended beyond modern scientific methods, unavailable to medieval observers. Even using only techniques accessible in the 12th century, obvious fraud should have been identifiable. Wood that showed no signs of aging despite claims of 1,000-year antiquity. Fragments supposedly from the same cross that were different wood types or showed incompatible construction techniques. Yet church officials regularly authenticated relics that skeptical examination would have questioned. Economic incentives overwhelmed intellectual honesty. Forgers operated openly in Jerusalem and Cyprus during the Crusader period. Workshops produced true cross fragments, thorns from the crown, and other passion relics at industrial scale. Some forgers were Christians who rationalized their work as serving pious purposes by providing objects that inspired devotion regardless of authenticity. Others were Muslim or Jewish merchants who viewed the operation as legitimate business meeting market demand. A few were cynical opportunists who recognized gullible buyers and exploited them for profit. The black market in cross fragments became so extensive that church councils attempted regulation. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 prohibited the sale of relics without proper authentication and papal approval. The decree was ignored universally because enforcement was impossible, and church officials themselves profited from the trade. Bishops who condemned forgery publicly often purchased questionable relics privately for their own cathedrals. The hypocrisy was obvious, but insufficient to stop practices that generated enormous revenue. Authentication specialists developed tests that claimed to distinguish genuine true cross wood from fraudulent substitutes. One method involved placing fragments on an altar overnight and observing whether they emitted supernatural light visible to spiritually pure observers. Another test measured the wood's weight, claiming authentic pieces weighed less than normal wood due to their sacred nature. A third technique exposed fragments to fire, arguing that genuine crosswood wouldn't burn. All three methods were subjective and easily manipulated to produce desired results. The proliferation created theological complications that scholars addressed through increasingly creative reasoning. How could splinters of wood divided into thousands of pieces retain the holiness of the original cross? Medieval theologians proposed that divine essence wasn't diminished by division, similar to how breaking the Eucharistic bread didn't reduce Christ's presence in each portion. The cross's spiritual power existed in every fragment regardless of size. This reasoning justified infinite subdivision, while maintaining that even microscopic splinters possessed authentic sacred properties. Military orders competed to acquire true cross fragments for their treasuries. Templars held several pieces obtained through unknown means during their Jerusalem excavations. Hospitallers possessed fragments received as donations from noble families. Teutonic knights secured pieces through purchases and battlefield recoveries. Each order carried its cross fragment into battle, believing divine protection favoured forces fighting under authentic relics. The competition drove prices upward as military commanders bid against each other for prestigious pieces. Crusader nobles established family chapels around true cross fragments brought back from the Holy Land. These private collections became status symbols equivalent to owning castles or extensive lands. Families that possessed authenticated cross pieces married into higher social ranks, leveraged the relics for political advantages, and used them as collateral for loans. The wood fragments functioned as medieval financial instruments with value that transcended their physical properties. Venice accumulated the largest concentration of true cross fragments outside Constantinople. Venetian merchants who financed the Fourth Crusade's sack of the Byzantine capital in 1204 claimed premium relics as return on investment. The wood pieces were displayed in San Marco Basilica in a reliquary that became a pilgrimage destination rivaling Jerusalem itself. The collection's economic impact transformed Venice from wealthy trading city to a central religious centre, generating tourism revenue that funded naval expansion and territorial acquisitions. The wood's physical properties created preservation problems that owners were reluctant to acknowledge. True cross fragments displayed without protective enclosure deteriorated from handling and environmental exposure. Churches that allowed pilgrims to touch relics directly found the wood wearing away from repeated contact. Yet admitting deterioration meant acknowledging the sacred object could be destroyed, contradicting theological claims about relics' eternal nature. Most institutions sealed fragments behind crystal or metal barriers to prevent further damage while maintaining that the protection was for the pilgrim's safety rather than the relic's preservation. Replacement of deteriorated fragments happened quietly when necessary. A church whose true cross piece had been reduced to dust through centuries of pilgrim touching would acquire a substitute from the underground market and present it as the original. Documentation would be adjusted to show continuous possession despite the actual replacement. Pilgrims and even local clergy often remained unaware that the relic they venerated was a recent substitution rather than the ancient artifact they believed it to be. The final Crusader defeats in the late 13th century scattered remaining true cross fragments further. Evacuating armies carried relics from churches about to fall to Muslim forces. Some pieces reached Europe successfully and entered cathedral collections where they remain today. Others were lost during desperate evacuations when ships sank or caravans were ambushed. Several fragments stayed hidden in Crusader territories, buried by defenders who hoped to recover them later but died before revealing the locations. Modern pilgrims visiting churches across Europe can still see dozens of true cross fragments displayed in medieval reliquaries. Some are demonstrably authentic 1st century wood from Palestine. Others are proven forgeries manufactured centuries after Christ's death. Most fall into an uncertain category, where scientific testing remains inconclusive and historical documentation is ambiguous. The wood continues to attract believers who find meaning in the physical connection to Christianity's founding event, while skeptics note the mathematical impossibility of so many authentic pieces existing from a single cross. The multiplication that began with Helena's initial division 900 years before the Crusades created a network of artifacts that transcended questions of authenticity through the devotion they inspired and the historical events they influenced. Jewish refugees fleeing Roman legions in 70 AD sealed ceramic jars containing sacred texts before abandoning Jerusalem. The scrolls documented temple rituals, preserved biblical commentaries, and recorded prophecies about future events. Priests who buried the materials intended them for recovery once Roman occupation ended. Instead, successive conquests buried the sites deeper under rubble and construction, hiding the scrolls so successfully that their exact locations were forgotten within a generation. Christian manuscripts faced similar concealment during the Persian invasion of 614 AD. Byzantine monks had accumulated extensive libraries in Jerusalem's monasteries over 3 centuries. Rather than allow Persian soldiers to burn irreplaceable documents, the monks distributed scrolls among multiple hiding locations throughout the city and surrounding wilderness. Cave systems near the Dead Sea received dozens of sealed containers. Underground chambers beneath churches held additional materials. Some caches were marked for later recovery. Others were hidden so desperately that the monks themselves forgot where everything was buried. Islamic conquest in 637 AD added another layer of concealed texts. Muslim scholars recognized the historical value of existing libraries and attempted to preserve important materials. Political instability during the Umayyad period created security concerns that prompted hiding certain controversial documents. Texts discussing alternative interpretations of religious history went underground. Prophecies that could be weaponized for political purposes disappeared into private collections. Scientific and philosophical works that contradicted orthodox theology were sealed in repositories accessible only to trusted scholars. The First Crusade's capture of Jerusalem in 1099 gave Western knights access to sites that hadn't been systematically searched in 4 centuries. While most commanders focused on looting gold and jewels, a few understood that knowledge held greater long-term value. Maps obtained from Byzantine sources indicated locations where ancient libraries had existed before Muslim conquest. Excavation orders went beyond seeking physical treasures to recovering written materials that Byzantine emperors had tried unsuccessfully to reach. Early discoveries were disappointing. Centuries of moisture had destroyed papyrus and damaged parchment beyond legibility. Workers found ceramic jars that crumbled when touched, their contents reduced to unreadable fragments. The preservation conditions in Jerusalem's climate proved far worse than the dry caves near the Dead Sea, where materials survived intact. Only documents sealed in lead containers or stored in exceptionally dry locations remained readable after extended burial. The Temple Mount excavations produced the first significant manuscript finds. Sealed bronze cylinders contained scrolls in Hebrew that dated to the Second Temple period, based on the script style and linguistic features. Translation revealed detailed descriptions of temple ceremonies, ritual purification procedures, and priestly succession records. More controversially, some texts described artifacts hidden before the Babylonian conquest, providing lists of what was concealed and possible locations where recovery might be attempted. Templar excavations between 1119 and 1128 went deeper than previous efforts. The 9 Knights worked systematically through chambers that earlier searchers had only partially explored. They found a cache of documents sealed in lead boxes sometime during the Byzantine period. The texts were in Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic, requiring translation by Jewish scholars hired specifically for the task. What the scrolls contained became one of the most closely guarded Templar secrets. Accusations against Templars during their suppression in 1307 included claims about heretical beliefs derived from texts discovered in Jerusalem. Interrogation records mentioned scrolls that contradicted official church teachings about Jesus' life and ministry. Some accused Templars of studying Jewish mystical texts that influenced their religious practices. Others claimed the Knights had found Gnostic Gospels describing alternative versions of Christian origins. Whether these accusations reflected actual discoveries or were fabricated to justify the Order's destruction remains historically uncertain. Evidence suggests Templars did encounter texts that challenged Orthodox theology. Their later adoption of banking practices forbidden to Christians, but permitted under certain Jewish interpretations of law, hints at exposure to alternative religious frameworks. Architectural symbolism in Templar buildings shows influences from Islamic and Jewish sacred geometry, rather than purely Christian designs. These cultural borrowings imply sustained engagement with non-Christian religious texts and ideas. Translation efforts in Crusader states created an intellectual exchange that transformed European scholarship. Arabic scientific texts were translated into Latin by bilingual Christians working in Acre and other coastal cities. Greek philosophical works preserved by Islamic scholars, but lost in the West, were recovered and reintroduced to European universities. Medical knowledge from Persian physicians reached Western doctors through translations commissioned by Crusader nobles interested in improving healthcare for their armies. The migration of this knowledge had profound long-term consequences. Aristotelian philosophy returned to Europe through translations from Arabic, sparking intellectual movements that eventually produced the Renaissance. Mathematical concepts from India and Persia, including the zero and algebraic notation, entered Western mathematics through Crusader period translations. Astronomical observations recorded by Islamic scholars improved European navigation and timekeeping. The Crusades functioned as a knowledge transfer mechanism as much as a military conflict. Apocalyptic prophecies discovered in Dead Sea caves attracted particular attention. Jewish and Christian texts describing end-time scenarios convinced some Crusaders that they were fulfilling ancient predictions. Scrolls mentioned armies from the West liberating Jerusalem, defeating enemies, and establishing a kingdom before a final cosmic battle. The descriptions matched Crusader experiences closely enough to suggest either genuine prophecy or documents written to describe historical events as if predicted. A scroll discovered in 1124 near Qumran described a teacher of righteousness, opposed by corrupt religious authorities. The parallels to Christ's story were obvious, but complicated by the text predating Jesus by at least a century. Priests who studied the document recognized it challenged claims about Christianity's uniqueness. The scroll suggested messianic expectations and conflicts with religious establishments existed in Judaism long before Jesus' ministry. Church authorities ordered the document sealed and forbidden from further study. Other texts proved even more problematic. Gnostic Gospels portraying Jesus as a wisdom teacher rather than divine savior appeared in several caches. These alternative gospels had been declared heretical by early church councils, but survived in hidden libraries. Crusaders encountering these texts faced cognitive dissonance between official theology and ancient Christian communities' apparently legitimate alternative traditions. Some knights concluded that early Christianity was more theologically diverse than official history admitted. The intellectual impact on individual crusaders varied dramatically. Most soldiers remained illiterate and uninterested in scholarly matters, focused purely on warfare and loot. Knight commanders and noble leaders who could read Latin encountered translated materials that sometimes shook their faith. A few became convinced they were uncovering suppressed truths about religious history. Others rejected the alternative texts as ancient heresies properly condemned by church authorities. The manuscripts created factions within Crusader leadership based on which theological interpretation seemed more credible. Jewish communities in Crusader territories provided crucial translation assistance despite facing persecution. Rabbis who could read ancient Hebrew scripts were coerced or paid to translate texts discovered during excavations. These scholars recognized materials from their own religious traditions that Crusaders misunderstood or misinterpreted through Christian theological frameworks. Some translators deliberately provided misleading interpretations to protect sacred Jewish texts from Christian appropriation. Others translated accurately, but watched Christian knights misapply Jewish wisdom in ways that seemed bizarre or sacrilegious. Islamic scholars faced similar pressures. Arabic manuscripts seized from libraries required translation into Latin for Crusader commanders to understand. Muslim intellectuals hired for this work found themselves translating scientific treatises, philosophical arguments, and occasionally religious polemics against Christianity. The experience gave Islamic scholars insight into Christian military leadership's intellectual limitations and theological insecurities. Reports back to Muslim-controlled territories described Crusaders as militarily dangerous, but intellectually inferior to Islamic civilization's scholarly achievements. The Templar suppression in 1307 scattered whatever manuscripts the order had accumulated. Philip IV of France raided Templar properties expecting to find gold, but discovered libraries instead. Inventories listed hundreds of books and scrolls in languages that French officials couldn't identify. Some materials were burned as heretical. Others were confiscated by the crown and disappeared into royal archives. A few were hidden by Templars who anticipated the arrests and moved the most sensitive materials to secure locations before French soldiers arrived. Conspiracy theories about hidden Templar libraries proliferated immediately and have persisted for 7 centuries. Legends describe scrolls buried beneath Scottish castles, sealed in caves across Europe, or transported to the New World by Templar fleets that allegedly crossed the Atlantic before Columbus. No verified Templar document cache has been discovered despite extensive searching. Either the hiding locations were chosen so well that they remain concealed, or the suppression was thorough enough to destroy materials that could have exposed what Templars actually found in Jerusalem. Modern archaeology has validated medieval legends about buried manuscripts in unexpected ways. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in 1947, proved that ancient texts could survive in Palestinian caves for 2,000 years when properly sealed. The documents matched descriptions in Crusader period accounts that historians had dismissed as fantasy. Scrolls describing Essene community practices and apocalyptic expectations were exactly what some medieval sources claimed existed near Jerusalem. The modern discoveries suggest Crusaders genuinely found ancient materials, though what they did with those discoveries remains mysterious. Carbon dating and linguistic analysis of Dead Sea Scrolls fragments proved they predated Jesus by decades to centuries. The text's content overlapped significantly with New Testament themes, showing that messianic expectations, ritual purification practices, and conflicts with temple authorities characterized Judaism before Christianity emerged. This historical context challenged traditional narratives about Christianity's radical break from Judaism. If Crusaders found similar materials in the 12th century, the theological implications would have been profound and threatening to Orthodox Church teaching. Scientific manuscripts proved less controversial than religious texts but equally valuable. Arabic translations of Greek medical texts by Galen and Hippocrates reached European universities through Crusader channels. Alchemical treatises describing chemical processes became available to Western scholars for the first time. Mathematical works explaining algebra and trigonometry entered university curricula. Astronomical tables compiled by Islamic observatories improved European navigation. This knowledge transfer accelerated Western scientific development by centuries compared to what would have occurred without Crusader contact with Islamic civilization. The disappearance of certain texts after Templar suppression suggests deliberate destruction of materials Church authorities found threatening. Interrogation records mention scrolls that accused Templars couldn't or wouldn't describe in detail, citing oaths of secrecy taken upon admission to the order's inner circle. Some tortured Templars claimed texts proved Christianity's teachings were corrupted from original sources. Others described prophecies that predicted the Catholic Church's fall and replacement by purified religious movements. Whether these claims reflected actual document contents or were fabricated under torture remains debatable. Libraries in European monasteries occasionally contain manuscripts marked as originating from Jerusalem or the Holy Land during the Crusader period. Cataloguing efforts have identified dozens of such texts and collections across France, Italy, and England. Most are biblical commentaries, prayer books, or saints' lives that pose no theological problems. A few contain marginal notes in Hebrew or Arabic, suggesting they were copied from older sources encountered in Palestine. None of the controversial materials mentioned in Templar trial records have been definitively identified in surviving collections. The knowledge acquired during the Crusades ultimately had greater historical impact than the territories conquered or relics recovered. Ideas encounter no resistance from military defeats. Texts copied and distributed cannot be recaptured like lost cities. The intellectual seeds planted when Western Europeans encountered preserved, classical knowledge through Islamic scholarship and discovered ancient manuscripts in Palestinian caves grew into the philosophical and scientific movements that transformed Europe over subsequent centuries. The artifacts hunters found objects that enriched individual churches and collectors. The knowledge hunters unleashed forces that reshaped civilization itself, making the search for scrolls perhaps the most consequential aspect of the entire Crusader enterprise, though medieval participants never recognized it as such. Muslim commanders noticed the excavation patterns immediately after the First Crusade captured Jerusalem. Intelligence reports described Christians digging beneath buildings with no apparent military purpose. Spies watching the Temple Mount observed knights entering underground chambers carrying tools instead of weapons. The activity suggested objectives beyond territorial occupation. Fatimid officials in Cairo compiled detailed accounts of the unusual behavior, attempting to understand what Crusaders sought that military conquest alone couldn't provide. Local Muslims who remained in Jerusalem under Crusader rule provided information to their former rulers. Workers hired for excavation projects reported back about locations being searched and materials being recovered. Some were genuine informants serving Islamic interests. Others sold information to both sides, profiting from the intelligence market that developed around the artifact hunt. The reports created a comprehensive picture of Christian excavation operations that Islamic commanders studied intensely. Saladin understood the strategic implications before he recaptured Jerusalem. His intelligence network tracked Templar movements and documented which sites received concentrated attention, Reports indicated Christians believed certain artifacts provided supernatural advantages in warfare. Whether Saladin personally credited such beliefs mattered less than recognizing his enemies did. Psychological warfare required either preventing Crusaders from obtaining these objects or capturing them to demoralize Christian forces. Islamic traditions about Jerusalem's hidden treasures predated the Crusades by centuries. Muslim scholars preserved accounts describing items buried during the city's various conquests. Stories circulated about Solomon's temple artifacts that survived destruction by Babylonians and Romans. These weren't purely Christian relics, but objects significant to Jewish and Islamic sacred history. The temple treasures belonged to shared Abrahamic heritage that transcended later religious divisions. Quranic interpretations and hadith collections mention sacred objects associated with biblical prophets. The staff Moses used to part the Red Sea, tablets containing divine revelations, ritual vessels from the tabernacle. Islamic theology recognized these items' importance, while understanding them differently than Christians did. The artifacts weren't Christian property, but remnants of prophetic traditions that Islam claimed as part of its spiritual lineage. Crusader excavations were seen as theft of Islamic religious heritage as much as Christian conquest. Saladin organized systematic surveys after recapturing Jerusalem in 1187. Teams entered areas Templars had excavated, mapping the tunnels and cataloguing what remained behind. Engineers examined the excavation techniques, noting where Christians had broken through barriers and where they had abandoned attempts. The underground archaeology revealed Christian search patterns that suggested maps or documents guiding their efforts. Muslim commanders wanted those source materials to understand what else Crusaders might be seeking. The Dome of the Rock became a fortress after reports surfaced about Templar tunneling beneath its foundation. Saladin posted permanent guards with orders to prevent any unauthorized access to underground spaces. Engineers sealed passages that Templars had carved, filling them with rubble mixed with mortar to make re-excavation difficult. The protection measures indicated Islamic leadership took seriously the possibility that important materials remained hidden beneath Jerusalem's holiest sites. Muslim forces conducting their own excavations found evidence of multiple previous searches, Byzantine tunnels from centuries earlier, Jewish hiding places from the Roman period, recent Crusader excavations that had reached specific chambers and removed contents. The layered history of underground operations showed that Jerusalem's value as an artifact repository transcended religious boundaries. Every civilization that controlled the city had searched for the same legendary treasures. Saladin's forces discovered sealed chambers that Crusaders had apparently overlooked. One contained ceramic jars with Arabic inscriptions dating to the early Islamic period. The texts inside describe philosophical debates between Muslim scholars about reconciling reason with revelation. Another cache held scientific manuscripts that had been hidden during the First Crusade to prevent destruction. These materials returned to Islamic libraries in Damascus and Cairo, where scholars could finally study them. A more significant discovery occurred beneath a mosque built over a Byzantine church foundation. Workers clearing Crusader rubble found a passage extending deeper than the Christian excavations had reached. Following the tunnel led to a chamber carved during the Herodian period. Stone shelves held containers that had been sealed before the Roman destruction of 70 AD. The contents were primarily deteriorated documents that crumbled when exposed to air. A few bronze objects survived intact, identified as temple implements based on their design and the Hebrew inscriptions they bore. Saladin faced a decision about what to do with Jewish artifacts discovered in Islamic-controlled territory. The objects predated both Christianity and Islam, belonging technically to Jewish heritage. Yet returning them to Jewish communities seemed politically impossible, given tensions between religious groups. Instead, Saladin ordered the items preserved in Damascus under guard, treating them as historical treasures rather than religious relics. The pragmatic approach acknowledged the artifact's significance while avoiding religious conflicts about ownership. The intelligence network Saladin developed provided remarkable detail about Christian artifact holdings. Informants in European port cities reported cargoes leaving Acre for Venice and Marseille. Descriptions of sealed crates and the military escorts protecting them suggested valuable contents. Saladin's agents tracked which European churches and noble families received materials from the Holy Land. The monitoring created comprehensive inventories of what Crusaders had removed from Jerusalem during their occupation. Diplomatic channels opened unexpected opportunities. Crusader nobles desperate for military alliances offered territorial concessions in exchange for specific artifacts. Saladin considered proposals that would have returned true cross fragments or other relics to Christian control if Europeans surrendered strategic fortresses. The negotiations revealed that some Western commanders valued sacred objects more highly than military positions. The equation of spiritual and material power made sense within medieval thinking, but still surprised Islamic observers who saw it as theological confusion. Richard the Lionheart proposed extraordinarily generous terms during negotiations in 1192. He offered to withdraw from contested territories and pay substantial tribute if Saladin would return the true cross fragment captured at Hattin. The offer demonstrated how completely Christians believed relics determined military outcomes. Saladin rejected the proposal not because the terms were unfavourable, but because keeping the cross inflicted ongoing psychological damage that territorial concessions couldn't match. The artifact's propaganda value exceeded any ransom. Some negotiations involved items that interested both sides equally. Manuscripts describing Solomon's wisdom attracted Muslim and Christian scholars simultaneously. Scientific texts that preserved Greek knowledge lost to both civilizations during various conquests became bargaining tools. A few exchanges actually occurred where Saladin traded materials that mattered more to Christians for items Islamic scholars valued more highly. These transactions demonstrated that pragmatic interests sometimes overcame religious antagonism when both parties benefited. The complexity of multi-sided artifact politics increased when Jewish communities became involved. Rabbis approached Muslim authorities requesting permission to search for materials hidden by their ancestors during Roman times. Saladin granted limited permissions, understanding that Jewish knowledge about ancient Jerusalem exceeded what either Muslims or Christians possessed. Some expeditions recovered items of exclusively Jewish religious significance. Others found materials that Muslims and Christians both claimed as their heritage. The overlapping sacred geographies created disputes that required diplomatic resolution. Saladin's personal interest in ancient texts drove some excavation decisions. He commissioned translations of Greek philosophical works found in hidden libraries. Scientific manuscripts on medicine, astronomy, and mathematics received priority for preservation and copying. The commitment to knowledge preservation transcended the military conflict, showing intellectual curiosity that contrasted with Crusader focus on religious relics. Islamic scholars working under Saladin's patronage produced translations and commentaries that eventually returned to Europe through commercial channels, ironically benefiting the Christian civilization that opposed Muslim rule. Christian artifacts captured during military victories presented theological questions. Relics that Crusaders believed possessed supernatural power were seen by Muslims as interesting historical objects, but lacking any genuine divine properties. Saladin allowed some captured relics to be returned through diplomatic channels when doing so served political purposes. Others were kept as trophies demonstrating Islamic military superiority. A few were destroyed deliberately to break Christian psychological attachment to material objects that Muslims viewed as idolatrous. The 1192 treaty ending the Third Crusade included secret clauses about artifact handling, that weren't publicized in official documents. Both sides agreed to stop excavating beneath certain sites to prevent further damage to Jerusalem's archaeological heritage. Restrictions were placed on removal of materials older than the Islamic conquest. Penalties for violating these terms were specified in diplomatic language but amounted to resumption of warfare. The agreement showed both civilizations recognized their excavation activities risk destroying irreplaceable historical materials in pursuit of temporary military advantages. Saladin's final years involved securing sites containing discoveries his forces had made. He issued orders before his death in 1193 that specific chambers beneath Jerusalem should be sealed permanently. The instructions indicated materials had been found that Saladin considered too dangerous or controversial to leave accessible. Engineers filled the designated spaces with stone and mortar, then disguised the locations so thoroughly that later generations couldn't find them even with detailed descriptions. What Saladin wanted hidden remains buried to this day. The sealing operations occurred at 3 known locations based on subsequent Islamic records. One was beneath the dome of the rock's foundation, in chambers that had been excavated during the Crusader period and then explored by Saladin's teams. Another was in the City of David area where ancient Jewish materials had been concentrated. The third was beneath the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, in passages that connected Christian and Islamic excavations. Workers completing the sealing were sworn to secrecy and dispersed to different regions to prevent them from sharing information. Islamic chronicles describe materials found during Saladin's excavations in frustratingly vague terms. References appear to objects of the prophets and writings from ancient times, without specifying what these items actually were. The deliberate obscurity suggests chroniclers either didn't know details or were instructed not to record them. Later Islamic scholars attempting to piece together what was discovered found contradictory accounts and missing documentation that indicated systematic concealment of information. The counter-hunt's ultimate success remains impossible to evaluate. Saladin prevented further Christian excavation and recovered some materials that Crusaders had overlooked. His intelligence network tracked what went to Europe, creating records that later Islamic governments used when attempting to reclaim cultural heritage. The sealing operations protected certain discoveries from both Christian and future Muslim investigation. Whether Saladin found artifacts matching the legendary items both sides sought is unknown. If he did, the knowledge died with him, leaving mysteries buried beneath Jerusalem alongside the physical objects that multiple civilizations searched for but perhaps none fully found.